When we develop strings, we decide what we want to make for whom we need to make them, and what they like to use and what their preferences are, and how we can provide all the things that they want and not any of the things they don't want.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and today we are talking strings. There are so many questions people have surrounding strings, and there's so many things I don't know, or I didn't know, until I sat down and chatted with Lyris Hung of Daddario Strings. And we dug deep into these questions, this mystery zone of strings that I think so many people have. We talk about some of the most common misconceptions about strings and the physics behind strings and string making and string technology. We then dig into how strings are put together. We talk string cores, we talk damping and winding. And then we finish up by talking about how to care for your strings. How are strings damaged? How do they go false? And how can you prevent this damage and extend the life of your strings? All topics that any string player, bass player or not, would benefit from hearing. So please share this out if you've got other string player friends and you'd like to have them get a little more life out of their strings and make string purchases a little more intelligently. We've got some great sponsors for this episode, the Upton Bass String Instrument Company and the Bass Violin Shop, and we'll chat more about them later. This conversation comes to you from the inside of my car in the Fort Bragg, California Starbucks parking lot as the sweat is pouring down my face from the rolled up windows so that you don't hear the power washers. So if the audio sounds a little hinky, that's life as a podcaster in the summer playing music festivals. But you will love this anyway. And we're going to start by talking about just what exactly Lyris does at Daddario.
Could you just briefly describe your role, what your job is at Daddario?
What do you do?
What do you do? Exactly.
Well, my official title is product manager, and I'm the product manager of the Orchestral Strings department at Daddario. And that basically just means I oversee what we call the life cycle of the product, so product life cycle, which means I determine, what products, if any, that we need to create, for whom they're created for, and, how to bring those to the market. And also, if necessary, when those products have sort of outlived their use. So I might, make a decision to discontinue something. And there's lots of, logistical things that fall in between that. And I also handle the artist relations for the orchestral world. So, a lot of that is creating relationships with users of the end product. And I do a lot of outreach. And so, that's part of what is involved in this string making presentation. It's a big integral part of our outreach program.
Part of this outreach program involves a slide presentation that Lyris does. And she shared this with me, and I kind of based the questions that I ask off of this slide presentation. So here she is sharing about why she does this presentation.
The main reason that I created this whole presentation and the idea of bringing it to musicians is, very generally speaking, there's not a lot of string knowledge, at least not in one place. And a lot of people don't know where to go to get their string knowledge. And so there's sort of little patchy bits of information here and there, and lots of misconceptions and myths, and lots of people guessing at what they think is happening with their strings. But, we really tried to create a sort of repository of information and sort of a concerted effort to get that information out in an organized form to as many musicians as we can. And frankly, a lot of it is based on physics. All of it's based on physics, but a lot of musicians, especially classical musicians, I find, are not really taught the physics of their instrument. They are taught how to hold their bow, and they're taught how to make a nice sound and, to play in tune and all those sort of rudiments, but nobody really is teaching the why of why that works, and so a lot of people are trying to figure it out on their own, and they're doing, they're putting all this effort into it, but they're not necessarily coming up with the right physical answers. They might be coming to the right musical results, but their explanations are often kind of all over the map.
Now we dig deeper into the physics of making a sound with a string. How does it work? How does it work with the bow? And how does it work plucked? Lyris helps me out with some terminology that I know I'll be using in future descriptions to students and other folks about strings.
I can picture the looks of confusion on my students' faces when I try to explain what's going on. Like, I'm not even like really sure, and I get like, could you maybe like just describe what happens when you bow a string, when you pluck a string, just kind of those fundamental details? Like, how does that string make sound come out into the world?
Okay. So on a very basic level, again, the string is vibrating. And when you pluck a string, as opposed to when you bow a string, the string is going into two different vibrational modes. So we talk about them slightly separately, though they're both kind of considered vibrational. When a string is vibrating, it's, obviously attached to it's touching your bridge, and that bridge is touching the top face of your instrument. And your instrument basically acting like an amplifier and taking those vibrations and amplifying them out through, the F holes and through the instrument itself, so you can hear the string as it interacts with your instrument. And with the two different ways of vibrational modes, with plucking, you've got sort of back and forth oscillating vibration. Like if you say, hey, imagine a string vibrating, it's, most people would sort of see it kind of just flopping back and forth, sort of side to side. But with the bow, it goes into something very specific called the slipstick motion, or the Helmholtz motion, named after the scientist who sort of codified it. And so it's a slightly different vibrational pattern. And it doesn't just do this side-to-side thing, because what it's doing is the string is sticking to the bow hair and slipping from the bow hair repeatedly very fast. And so that sort of back and forth motion under the bow creates sort of, I call it a whipping motion. It's almost like you're taking one end of a jump rope and sort of flicking it, and that creates this sort of wave almost. And if you look at, I don't know if you were able to see the video that was in the slide, but there's a lot of slow-mo bow interacting with the string videos that are really fascinating, because it's just not at all what most people expect.
Okay, that's a bit about how the physics of strings actually work. And if you'd like to see that Helmholtz effect in action, there's a link in the show notes. We're going to dig in next to string cores, damping agents, and windings. What exactly goes into strings, all these layers? And before we dive into the second part of today's episode, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsor, Upton Bass. And this week we're talking about their Concord model bass, which is based off of the wonderful basses by Abraham Prescott. If you've ever seen a Prescott double bass, they're kind of like the Stradivarius of basses. I mean, really just outstanding instruments. And Upton, they realized in 2012, after making hundreds of basses in their Connecticut workshop and working on numerous Prescotts for sale, for repair, for restoration, they realized, why haven't we made a bass like this? And why are we just now realizing it? How could we, Upton, be New England makers without making a New England bass? So they got together, they made this bass. It's got similarities to the Gary Carr model bass in the upper bouts, and it's got Bussetto corners and these special Prescott F holes. So tonally, this bass is similar to their Brescian model double bass. It's got deep, dark, and punchy qualities with tonal color that's kind of like a rich pipe organ under the bow. In fact, that's how Prescott basses are often described, as kind of like an organ, only in bass form. Beautiful instruments. Check them out. You can get them in 3/4, 7/8, or full-size basses at uptonbass.com. All right. We're digging into part 2, string construction. We start by talking about string cores. What exactly goes into these cores?
I guess another big question is, there are all these different types of strings, and they can sound radically different, right? Like an unwound gut string and a steel core string. So could we maybe like go through what's in that string? Like, what are the different types of cores that are typically used?
Sure. So the most traditional type of core is, as you mentioned, like a gut core, and plain gut strings were some of the materials that we used on these types of instruments, the violin family instruments. And so gut is still used, but it's become less popular in general because of a number of things. Gut is not commonly used for most most of the things that he was used for 100 or 200 years ago they're just not used for anymore because of modern materials, plastics. So gut is very much a specialty item, and so it has a much more inflated cost these days. Very generally speaking, most people don't really want to pay that much for their strings. So it has sort of become relegated to a more specialty type of string, and it's obviously still very popular for things like Baroque playing, and it still has a lot of fans, but it's much more of a specialty material these days. So then I would say about, at this point, 100 and some odd years ago, a little over 100 years ago, people started to use steel as a substitute for some strings. Most notably, it was used as a violin E string, and they just took a solid piece of steel, like a steel wire, and used that. Mostly because gut E strings were really, really finicky, and you're obviously taking a piece of gut and pulling it at a very high tension to a very high pitch, and because of that, a lot of times you'd snap your E string. So when steel came along, people, while they weren't necessarily thrilled with the sound of it at first, because it was really, really different than a plain gut E string, the consistency and the ability to play an actual concert without having to change your E string was really attractive. So, and to this day, you still actually have most violin E strings are just a solid steel piece. It's more of a sophisticated steel, but it's still kind of the same basic construction. Then off of that, we created what's called a stranded steel core, which is like a cable. Some people call it a rope core, a cable core, basically something that is created out of multiple fine strands of steel that have been twisted or braided or to construction crane cables and suspension bridge cables and radial tire cable, the steel belts in your tires. Pretty much any application where you need the strength of steel, but you need a little bit more elasticity, a little more flexibility. And so by cabling steel, you get a little more stretch. And that stretch allows it to flex. So, for instance, like a suspension bridge, you wouldn't want to have just solid pieces of steel because everything's kind of always moving on a bridge. And so that helps it kind of have that give. And then the last kind of major family of core materials is synthetics. And so these are plastics, and they fall into mostly what's called a multi-filament, and that just means lots of filaments, many filaments. So it's like a bundle of fibers, basically, like plastic fibers. Visually, it resembles something like a bunch of doll's hair, like a bunch of very fine pieces of thin plastic kind of bundled together. And there's a whole bunch of different types of synthetics that can be used. We commonly use nylon, which is also known as Perlon, and we also use a slightly more sophisticated version of it that's called PEEK, P-E-E-K. It stands for, I believe, polyether ketone, something like that. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, so people call it PEEK. And so, yeah, the synthetic family is pretty diverse. And, we can create different stretches and different densities and different sizes of fibers. And so it's because it is a synthetic material, we have a lot of control over that. So it's probably the most diverse family of material there.
Lyris then talks about what types of cores are used in some of the various Daddario brands.
One is in the stranded steel category, and the other is in the synthetic category. And we don't use solid steel cores for our double bass strings because when you use a solid steel piece as a core at such a low pitch and a long length, you start to end up with functional issues because the steel gets too stiff and it doesn't vibrate nicely. So we use only cable steel, so stranded steel for all of our bass strings. But we do use solid steel for the small instruments, cello, viola, and violin in the prelude line. So that being said, you named helicore and Kaplan, and those fall into the stranded steel group. They're all different types of cores. So they're all stranded steel, but they're all different formations. So, for instance, like the helicore orchestral and the helicore hybrid and the helicore pizzicato and the helicore solo have slightly varied core constructions and also slightly varied from string to string. So we wouldn't necessarily use the exact same core from like the G string to the E string, for instance, because we need to create a different amount of mass, and we may need to, work with a different number of winding materials. So we use the core that's right for that particular formula. And then Zyx is our only synthetic string for bass at the moment. And that is made with a peak core. It's actually called Zyx. It's a Zyx core. And that for those strings, you'll notice they're slightly thicker in diameter, the Zyx, than, say, the Kaplan or the helicore. And primarily a product of the synthetic core being lower mass. So because it is lower mass, it needs more of it. And so we use kind of a big bundle of that fiber for the core, and then we wind with higher mass materials on the outside.
In terms of the helicore, is it what dampens it that changes, or like how maybe just with those strings, like what varies between those?
There's a number of things that vary, so there's not really a simple answer, unfortunately. Yes, the core varies. There's also some windings that vary in terms of their size and their proportion to each other. The amount of damping material that we put in there does vary as well. So because we're developing strings, sort of taking a step back. When we develop strings, we decide what we want to make for whom we need to make them, and what they like to use and what their preferences are, and how we can provide all the things that they want and not any of the things they don't want. So very generally speaking, we are not customizing a string for every player, but we're customizing strings for a group of players or a sort of subsection of players. So rather than try to take one model and kind of like make them all the same except for one little tweak, a lot of times we have to make, sometimes significant changes between models, between brands, and between the sub-brands as well. So for instance, Kaplan and Kaplan Solo, this is a good example of that, where we use the same philosophy, like people wanted to have, and Kaplan, when we first developed the original Kaplan, people wanted to have a really kind of easy bow response, something that was sort of darker on the orchestral side of things, and yet could be expressive and had the volume that was needed, but wasn't overly bright. And so we really kind of focused on that. When we developed the solo version of it, people still, we interviewed lots and lots of players, and they said, we really like the bow ability of the Kaplan. But obviously for solo tuning, we do want a little more projection, a little bit more brightness, but we still like the warmth. And so we had to sort of find that sweet spot there. And so we did have to change a whole bunch of things, but we used the same philosophy. So we were able to use very similar core technologies, but then we changed a lot of the other things around it, and the damping level and, winding, and that sort of thing.
Okay, you heard Lyris talk about dampening, I think I might have said, but damping, I think is the term. And what these agents are that are put into the string that keep it from ringing out completely. What's this all about? I think that's a big mystery zone, and Lyris does a wonderful job of clearing this up.
So a dampening or damping is basically like controlling a string's vibrations. So the more damped something is, the less it tends to ring out. And while we do want things to have some resonance, for things like bowed strings, when you're bowing something, so the very basic physical principle is the longer it takes for a vibrational system to die down, the longer it takes to start up. So if you have a vibrational system that like rings out and out and out for a long time, it's going to be much harder to start with a bow. And bass players really know this, because if you've ever bowed a very bright pizzicato type string, you'll note it's really hard to articulate. It's hard to get it started, and then you have to strain yourself to really get it to articulate and play fast stuff. Whereas very generally speaking, again, like the darker, more orchestral, traditionally orchestral strings, which are designed for arco, are much easier to bow, much easier to start, but they don't ring out as much. So like you wouldn't necessarily pick them first for like a pizzicato string. So with that in mind, we have to know what we're trying to do first before we determine how much damping material we need to put in. So if we're creating something like a Zyx, which we designed to be a pizzicato string, we're going to have very little damping, if any, in there, and we're going to try to go for brightness, and go for the resonance and the sort of sustain of the string. So helicore pizzicato is another good example of that. It doesn't have damping in it. It's a very bright string, whereas helicore orchestral has more damping in it, and it's designed, to have a much shorter sustain. So that material, what we use anyway, is a sort of thick, like a viscous gel type material, and that sits between the core and the first winding, and that just basically stays there. And you can create the idea of damping from a whole bunch of things, but so any two materials kind of rubbing against each other, interacting with each other, will naturally start to dissipate the vibration. So if you have one winding on a core, that winding and that core are going to, naturally create a little bit of damping, probably very little damping. But then if you throw another winding on top of that, it's going to create more damping, and so on and so forth. And if you create if you put on like a soft material on there, for instance, if you did a nylon, or if you wrapped some nylon on that string, that would create more damping. It kind of has the effect of actually dampening the vibration of the string.
So we've covered cores, we've covered damping agents, and then there's winding, another major obvious piece of the string. How does that work? What are the tonal playability characteristics? That's what we cover next.
Winding and the way we wind it, the direction we wind them, the angle at which we wind it, the tension at which we pull the material, and the material type itself, the thickness and the width, everything has an effect on the sound and the playability, the bow response, and the physical feel of the string. So absolutely, windings are super, super important. And why we wind strings. So way back when we had plain gut strings, we were just basically taking a piece of gut, making it sort of a noodle shape. But as any bass player who's actually seen a plain gut string knows, for a double bass, you have to create a lot of mass on those low notes, because you need a lot of mass on the instrument to create those low pitches. More mass vibrating creates a lower pitch. And so those plain gut strings had to be super thick, and they were like tree trunks. They were so giant, So if you have something that giant, it's really hard to bow. It's just, it doesn't, and it also doesn't necessarily vibrate that well because it becomes too stiff, and it's just very, very unplayable in the grand scheme of things. So people started to wind, which is to put material almost perpendicular, I guess, not really perpendicular, but almost along the length of the string. And this was usually metalled at first, and still to this day is mostly metal, in order to add mass to the string without sacrificing the flexibility of the string. So you could then use a thinner core and then add mass by putting metal, which is much higher density than something like gut, on the string, and you could create a thinner string that still had the same amount of mass and could be, played more easily. So that's why we wind strings. And so most strings, I would say most strings are wound these days, with very few exceptions. And the violin E string being one of them. Most times you don't need a winding on the violin E string because it's just so high. You don't need a lot of mass on it. But pretty much every other string these days is wound because we've sort of gotten used to the idea of this really nice, thin, flexible string.
That's what goes into the strings. We got those three elements. We've got the core, we've got the damping agents, and we've got the winding. And for our third and final part of this episode, we're going to talk about string care, how and why strings go bad, and what you can do to extend the life of your strings. Before we dig into that, I'm going to give a shout out to another sponsor that, by the way, if you're looking for strings, you can go there and pick up strings, the Bass Violin Shop. They carry strings, they carry bow cases, wheels, bass covers, mutes, quivers, rosin, polish, every type of gadget, pickups that you need for playing. The Bass Violin Shop has it. So give them a visit, bassviolinshop.com. They've been a great sponsor, and pick up a set of Daddario strings or any type of string from the Bass Violin Shop. Part 3, string care.
What advice do you give to people just to sort of lengthen the life and keep the strings in good playing condition?
Yeah, I get a lot of this question. People often ask me, I don't want to spend a lot of money. What can I do? And I mean, my answer is unfortunately really, really simple. And that's just to clean your strings, to keep your strings really clean. And a lot of people, moan and at that, because they clean their strings. Most people will clean their strings, but not often enough. And so what happens is, when we touch our strings and we, have our skin against the strings, we have body oils and moisture, sweat, whatever sort of things are on our fingers at that moment, touching the strings and getting stuck on the strings and often getting stuck inside the winding. And we don't really, like, theoretically, most people know that this is happening, but we don't really know how detrimental that is to the string because it's so hard to see. So what's happening is, like, if you're sweating just a little bit, that sweat will go inside the windings because it's a liquid, and the windings they're not hermetically sealing the string. They're just there, and there's little gaps that you can kind of get into, and that moisture goes in. And especially if you're using metal core strings, so most bass players are using some sort of a steel core at some point in their life, and that steel core is highly susceptible to corrosion because it's not stainless steel. So, unfortunately, that can kind of eat away quicker than we'd like and kind of create corrosive elements in there. So you either start breaking the string or you have what's called artificial damping that's happening because the stuff that's crudding up inside is creating more damping, but unevenly. So it's not helping you out. It's basically, making your string less and less uniform.
Do I get out my giant bottle of rubbing alcohol and damp down a cloth and, like, rub down those strings vigorously, or, like, what do I do to keep my strings healthy?
I would say most times you can get away with just a clean dry cloth. Like, if you're cleaning pretty, every time you play, you can get most of the stuff off with a clean dry cloth. If you're playing and you forget, and especially with bass rosin, it tends to harden and gunk up pretty easily because of the wax content in it. It's much stickier. If you see that it does gunk up, you can use a solvent like rubbing alcohol, but I would always recommend using it incredibly carefully in very, very small amounts, and to use it on a clean cloth. And not just to kind of haphazardly throw it on anything and kind of shove it around. Because what happens is you get it sloppy and you might touch the instrument and take off some of the varnish, and that's no good. A lot of people also try to, like, use water, and that's no good either because the water dry inside and it doesn't dry like alcohol does. It basically becomes a corrosive element. It starts to rust your string. So anyone who's trying to, like, power wash their strings with water is probably getting the stuff off the top of the surface, but adding to the problem on the interior.
The phenomenon of strings going false, starting to sound strange between the open strings and the harmonics. Most of you have probably realized this with your strings, and that's another mystery zone for a lot of people, especially me. So we talk about how and why strings go false.
The idea of just, like, strings going false, like you play an open string and the harmonics aren't quite true. I mean, is that in my mind, or is that a real thing? Is that an effect of aging strings?
Yeah, you're not crazy. That's definitely a thing. So that whole idea of the Helmholtz motion and the vibrating string. There's a way for it to be correct, and then there are sort of degraded versions of that vibrational mode. So, for instance, if you imagine that, back to this sort of imaginary corner that's kind of going up and down the ellipse, if you have a string that has, like, a 1-inch section that is stiffer or different than the rest of the string somehow, when that vibration gets to that point, it's going to kind of hiccup. It's not going to vibrate the same as along the length of the rest of the string. And the more irregularities you have on that string, the more of those you'll start to actually hear. And that will make it hard to intonate because all the upper harmonics and the overtones will start to become out of tune with the fundamental, and it'll be really hard to, kind of get your true pitch. And so, because our ears pick up so much of the overtones, it starts to sound really fuzzy. Sometimes, very, very rarely you have an issue with the instrument that's causing some sort of weirdness with the string, the bridge or something, or, it just not be working functionally right. But, the vast majority of instruments, you can look at them and tell if they're functional. If you put the string on and it, if you're playing it and the string's been on there for a while, and you suspect that it's just an old string, most times the falseness is because it's an old string.
We're going to end today with some final thoughts from Lyris, and I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Do you like these deep dive, technical geek out sort of episodes? I enjoy them, and I think probably a lot of people do, but I'd love to hear from you, and let me know if you want more of these. I've got another one coming up probably next week or very soon with Seth Kimmel about different types of woods and their tonal characteristics for bass, things outside of the maple and spruce world, although we do talk about maple and spruce as well. So do you like these? Let me know. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com will put you in touch with me, and I answer each and every email. And if you enjoyed this, the best thing you could do is share this out. Go on Facebook and share this link. Go on Twitter, share it if you use Twitter, whatever you use, share this out. Email it to a friend, share it with a student, share it with a colleague. That would be wonderful. So we finish off today's episode. This is the last thing you're going to hear. We'll just fade out after this, is just some final thoughts from Lyris. And thank you, Lyris, for chatting. Links to everything we talked about, that Helmholtz video, Daddario Orchestral, and other things we covered are in the show notes.
The last thing that I would leave people with, and this is just sort of generally about strings, because a lot of people get confused about what's best for them and, which direction should I go? And I get a lot of people asking me, what's the best string? And it's very, very, very subjective. The only thing that I can sort of leave people with, generally speaking, is that, you do have to take the time to try stuff out. And yes, you can sort of go by some of these landmarks, like, oh, I like stranded steel, or I like the synthetic core, or whatever it is. But the fact is that there's like hundreds of variables within every single string formula, and adjusting any one of those, let alone multiple of them, can create drastically different strings and drastically different experiences. So I would encourage people, and I think with the bass market, we're very fortunate to have a lot of open-minded bass players out there who are willing to take the time to try strings. And so, basically saying, take that time, try your friends' instruments, try your friends' strings. A couple bass players have told me about these cool things where they've pooled their money and bought a whole bunch of different strings and kind of tried them amongst each other's basses on each other's instruments and kind of swap them around just to get that experience. And that's really invaluable, because I can tell you, like, oh, this is a bright string and that bows easily, but like you won't know exactly how it is for you until you actually try it.